Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another video on the Cold War. This particular video is going to look at the wars in Southeast Asia as a result of the spread of communism during the Cold War. So what we're looking at first here is this particular map shows us the region of French Indochina. This was a French colony in Southeast Asia. They took control of it really in the 1800s. They were looking for cheap raw materials, especially things like rubber. And also, of course, a forward operating base to expand their influence in Asia. Now, we're going to look at two different pieces of this particular region when it comes to the expansion of communism. And the first one is going to be the country of Vietnam. Vietnamese people, one of the things we have to understand about them is they have been in a historically kind of a bad position because, of course, they're just on the southern border with China. And what that means is that the Vietnamese people have gotten used to fighting wars and being taken and dominated by much larger and much more powerful countries like China. And that is just part of their historical condition. They are used to that, and it makes them extremely tough people. Now, during World War II, the Japanese invaded French Indochina and they invaded Vietnam, and the Vietnamese fought them off very bravely. And again, this is something that they're used to. They are used to being the underdog in a war over their homeland, and they're used to fighting extremely long campaigns against other countries. Now, following 1945, when the Japanese are defeated at the end of World War I, in Vietnam, what we see is the growth of a sense of nationalism. And the guy who's really the most responsible for this growth in the sense of nationalism is the man on the right here, whose name was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese nationalist, and he believed that Vietnam should be for Vietnamese people. And so one of the things that he was really looking at after World War II was he wanted independence for the Vietnamese people from France. He wanted their independence movement to be successful after World War II. In 1946, February the 28th of 1946, and this actually is a primary source document that you can see, President Ho Chi Minh of the Republic of Vietnam sends a telegram to the President of the United States, Harry Truman, and what he's asking for here is he would like American help in achieving independence from France. However, we have to keep this in mind that this is happening in 1946. This is just when the Cold War is getting started. The tensions are very high, especially in Europe. People are worried about communism continuing to spread to the rest of the world. President Truman is establishing the policy of containment. And so when Truman looks at this particular letter, he says, you know, I understand that the Vietnamese really kind of want independence, and that would be great if they could get it, but it's not a good idea for the United States to help them. We don't want to risk weakening our NATO ally of France in order to help the Vietnamese people. And so Truman ultimately refuses him in giving him help for fighting for the independence of the Vietnamese people. Now, during the Cold War, of course, one of the things you have to realize is it's kind of like having that old kids game of when you go and ask mom and mom says no. Most kids realize that until they get caught and get in even bigger trouble, the best plan is to then go and ask dad, because then maybe you'll get a different answer and you can play them off of each other and ultimately get what you want. Well, Ho Chi Minh was that kid, and when the United States said no, he decided to go to their enemies, and he went to the Soviet Union for aid and for assistance. And the Soviet Union said, well, if we help the Vietnamese, it weakens France, which weakens NATO, which puts us in a better position of power. And that's good, and we would like to do that. But, of course, there is one catch, and the one catch is Ho Chi Minh is going to have to become a communist. And so Ho Chi Minh thinks over it for a while. Eventually, he does accept help from the Soviet Union. He becomes a communist, but he is also still, first and foremost, a nationalist. Now, how is he going to fight the French? I mean, France is a super powerful, very wealthy, very industrialized kind of a country. How are they going to fight against the French? Ho Chi Minh has fighting with him a general named Vo Nguyen Giap. And General Giap is actually a really, really brilliant military general because he really understands how the French think and what the French think, especially of the Vietnamese people. So he puts together a strategy to convince the French that they're really, really great soldiers and that the Vietnamese are afraid of them. So if we look at the map of Vietnam, we have to start up there in the north, in the northern part of Vietnam, in a place called Hai Phong, which is Haiphon. You can see it up there on the upper right-hand side of the map of Vietnam. In Hai Phong, the French Navy was there, the French Air Force was there. They had lots and lots of resources, and ultimately they were very much in control of Hai Phong Harbor. That's where General Giap starts the war, and what he did was he ordered his soldiers to start fighting the French, and as soon as the French started to fight back, General Giap ordered his men to turn around and run away. When they did, you have to think about this from the point of view of the French. The French see these Vietnamese soldiers fighting them, and as soon as they put up any resistance at all, the Vietnamese soldiers turn around and run. And so from the point of view of the French, they think the Vietnamese are just bad soldiers. They think these guys are cowards, and so they chase after them. And they move out of Hai Phong, and they continue to move further and further west to Hanoi, and then further west all the way out to Dien Bien Phu, which you can see all the way out there in the left-hand side of the country, in the western part of the country, right on the border with Laos. Now, once we get to Dien Bien Phu, the thing you have to realize is the French Navy's not there. The French Air Force isn't there. All of the advantages that the French have has been evaporated because, of course, General Giap has tricked the French Foreign Legion into following his soldiers all the way across the country and further away from their support and from their huge advantage to the city of Dien Bien Phu. Now, Dien Bien Phu is actually kind of a bowl-shaped region where there's a ring of mountains around the outside and there's a low flat valley in the middle. The French Foreign Legion set up its headquarters in the valley ringed by mountains at Dien Bien Phu. This happens in 1954, where the French Foreign Legion sets itself up in Dien Bien Phu. General Giap then waits all this time, and eventually in 1954 he springs the trap. In those mountains around Dien Bien Phu, General Giap has set up heavy artillery and cannons, and he starts mercilessly bombarding the French, to the point where the French realize that they're going to lose. And ironically, the French also come to the United States to ask us for help in keeping and securing their empire, which the United States is completely unwilling to do. We were unwilling to help the Vietnamese get independence, but we're also unwilling to help the French deny the Vietnamese independence. And so in 1954, the decision was made that Vietnam was going to get its independence, but everybody's really afraid because, of course, Ho Chi Minh is, by this point, a communist, and everybody knows that he's getting help from the Soviet Union. And since we wanted to contain the spread of communism, the concern was we don't want to just create a new communist country in the world. So what they did was they sat down in the peace negotiations, and they put together an operation called Operation Path to Freedom. And they said, listen, if you live in the southern part of Vietnam and you want to be a communist, you're allowed to move to the north. If you live in the northern part of Vietnam and you don't want to be a communist, you get to move to the south. And so we're going to create two countries: communist Vietnam in the north, and non-communist Vietnam in the south. Now, that is reasonably okay for some people because ultimately they're getting independence from France and they've got the option of being a communist or being not a communist. But for nationalists like Ho Chi Minh, having two Vietnams isn't good, right? That's not the whole point of nationalism, right? It's one people, one country. Well, if Vietnamese people are one people, they should have one country according to nationalist ideology. So Ho Chi Minh starts under this presumption that the two-country system is not going to work. He needs to unify North Vietnam and South Vietnam. He starts, therefore, a group of people called the Viet Minh. Later, they'll be called the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong start a guerrilla war, which means they're not an army, they're not regular military soldiers, these are irregular soldiers. These are civilians, people who hide in the daytime and then at night will attack their enemies, and they'll blend into the population, and they're very, very, very difficult to find because, of course, all the people that you're looking at in Vietnam are Vietnamese, pretty much. And so it's very difficult to distinguish a communist supporter from a non communist. The Viet Cong are from North Vietnam. They are communist rebels. But the place that they're operating is South Vietnam. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to unify those two countries together by making the government of South Vietnam fall apart. In September of 1959, the North Vietnamese guerrillas, the Viet Cong, begin their terrorism campaign in South Vietnam to try to collapse the government and to get the two countries to unify together as one unified, independent, and also communist Vietnam. Now, the president of South Vietnam, his name was Ngo Dinh Diem. His goal was to try to stop the advance of communism. He was an anti-communist. Now, because he was an anti-communist, President Eisenhower of the United States and also President John F. Kennedy of the United States considered him to be a good guy and someone that we were willing to support from the 1950s all the way up until 1963. In 1963, President Kennedy made the decision that he was going to give the go-ahead for an assassination of President Diem in South Vietnam. President Kennedy and this is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara felt that President Diem was no longer going to be able to manage South Vietnam, and so they allowed other people in South Vietnam to assassinate him. The problem with that, though, is that it sent South Vietnam into complete and total chaos, and everything started to fall apart. President Kennedy then responded with an increase in levels of support to the South Vietnamese government. Now, of course, we also know that in November of 1963, President Kennedy himself was assassinated, leaving Vice President Johnson behind to become the new President of the United States. And as you can see here, in 1964, President Johnson started to massively expand American involvement in Vietnam. We went from a position of helping the South Vietnamese and training the South Vietnamese and arming the South Vietnamese to sending American soldiers and American troops to South Vietnam to take responsibility for stopping the spread of communism. This was based on an idea called domino theory, which said that the countries of Southeast Asia were basically set up like dominoes. China fell first, then Korea, now Vietnam. And if South Vietnam is able to fall, then after that it's going to be Cambodia, and then Laos, and then Thailand, and then India, and then eventually when all of Asia becomes communist, then instead of fighting communism in Asia, we'll be fighting communism in Europe, and then eventually maybe even the United States. The thought process then became, if we can stop the spread of communism in Vietnam, those other countries will be safe. And so the United States got massively involved in Vietnam in 1964 and sent American soldiers out to stop the Viet Cong guerrillas, the Viet Cong rebels. Now, the problem is that's a really hard war to fight because it's not like World War II where we can talk about if you start in the south and keep advancing north until you conquer territory, and once you defeat the enemy government, there is no enemy government. The enemy that you're fighting are terrorists who are trying to overthrow the government. They don't control territory. They don't control much territory, at least. They don't come out and fight upright. There's no real tank battles. This is a very, very different kind of war. The strategy that the United States used was they turned this into what's called a war of attrition, which means we're going to kill so many Viet Cong that they're eventually going to give up. Now, the problem with that is they're fighting over their home. And when you're fighting over your home, you don't have anywhere to run away to. You don't have any ability to stop and surrender, whereas the United States is fighting on the other side of the world for a country that most Americans don't care about, that most Americans didn't know anything about, that most Americans didn't want to sacrifice themselves or their sons over. And so the idea that the United States was going to be able to hold out against this very determined enemy that is used to fighting much larger countries for, and they have been used to fighting larger countries for thousands and thousands of years, really just, it was an idea that didn't work very well. The concept that we used, the tactics that we used were called search and destroy tactics. American infantry units would go out into the rice paddies and we would go out into the jungles of South Vietnam and we would just look for a fight. Once we found the Viet Cong and we would start fighting, they would get on the radio. The American soldiers would get on and Marines and sailors and airmen would get on the radio and they would call for support, which, of course, using the new concept of air cavalry, which means you bring in massive amounts of soldiers really, really super quick using helicopters. We would find the Viet Cong, we would drop off a whole bunch of soldiers around them, and we would try to exterminate the enemy. The problem is, by the time we got around to doing that, a lot of times these guys would just disappear into the jungle. It was very, very difficult to fight them in the jungle that they called home. And again, it's by and large because they were used to this. Now, at the same time, President Johnson authorized an operation from 1965 till 1968 called Operation Rolling Thunder, which was the continuous bombardment of Vietnam. The problem is Vietnam really didn't have big industrial cities that we could bomb because we were not fighting the Vietnam War in North Vietnam. The concern was if we bombed North Vietnam, one of the things that might happen is we could kill, some Soviet citizens or some Chinese citizens, and ultimately that could lead to a wider war during the Cold War. So the Vietnam conflict is pretty much entirely contained within the country of South Vietnam. So when you're blowing up these areas of jungle, it doesn't really accomplish very much. The problem, of course, that we didn't really realize is bombing jungle doesn't work when the Vietnamese people have been, since World War II, digging tunnels underground. What we're seeing here is during the course of Vietnam, one of the worst jobs to have in the American military was to be what we call a tunnel rat. When they would find tunnels that had been dug underground, a member of the American military had to go in and clear those tunnels out. And so generally speaking, you had to go in by yourself with a flashlight, a knife, and a pistol, and you had to crawl around on your hands and knees, being very careful to watch out for booby traps, to see if you could find where these guys are and to then eventually destroy the tunnel. Super scary, very difficult, extremely dangerous, both because, of course, a lot of times these tunnel entrances were booby-trapped, as well as the fact that you've got angry Viet Congs inside those tunnels waiting for you, and they know how the tunnel works. They know where the tunnel leads. They know the tunnel backwards and forwards, because a lot of these guys have grown up in these tunnels because this war has been going on since the 1940s. The tunnel complexes themselves were extremely extensive, and sometimes these things could go on for miles. They would have multiple entrances and exits. They would have cooking facilities. Some of the tunnels could hide whole communities worth of people. And of course, they were camouflaged so that you really didn't know where they were. This is why it was so incredibly difficult to fight this type of a war using search and destroy tactics. These guys could wait for us to get in the middle of nowhere, pop up out of their tunnels, shoot at the Americans, and then as soon as we started fighting back, they could go hide in their tunnels again, and it was like they just disappeared into the jungle. That process continued from 1964 really until 1968. During the spring of 1968, we got an experience called the Tet Offensive. The North Vietnamese army actually did come out and attack, and the Viet Cong did come out and attack, and they attacked our military bases. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a huge success for the United States. We massively defeated them militarily. The problem becomes people back in the United States started the anti-war movement, saying that ultimately this is not a war that we can win. It's not a good war. It's not a war that's being fought correctly. And even though the Tet Offensive was a military victory, it was a public relations failure, and a lot of people in the United States started to turn against our involvement in the Vietnam War. 1968 was a big deal as well because not only did we get the Tet Offensive in the early part of the year, in November of that year we had a presidential election. During the summer of 1968, of course, everybody pretty much knew who was going to win the election, and that was going to be Bobby Kennedy, President John Kennedy's younger brother. Unfortunately, after he had won the nomination for the presidency, he was assassinated. And that left the field wide open. So extremely late in the contest, Richard Nixon entered the race, and what he told people was he had a secret plan to win the Vietnam War. People then voted for him, and he won in 1968. And when he took office in 1969, he started a policy that was called Vietnamization, which means he was going to turn over responsibility for fighting the Vietnam conflict to the Vietnamese people themselves. He was going to get the United States out of Vietnam. Now, he said, in order to do that, we've got to make sure we establish what he called peace with honor, which means the Vietnamese have to take over this war, win or lose, but we want to set them up in a good position to be able to win it, we hope. And so he actually, for a while, expanded the war using what we called the Christmas bombings, which means he blew up elements of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the resupply route that went through Laos and Cambodia and allowed the Viet Cong to resupply themselves. He also sent American Marines to invade the country of Cambodia to deny them access to some of their bases and to blow up some of their resources in an operation that we call Operation Linebacker. While this was going on, he started ramping up the army of the Republic of Vietnam, they called them ARVN, or the South Vietnamese, to take responsibility for this war. And slowly through the 1970s, he started to remove American soldiers and American troops and American support until eventually, of course, turning the war entirely over to the South Vietnamese. That happened in 1975 when American soldiers finally came home. And of course, this is a very famous scene of the American embassy in Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam, in 1975. As the communists came in and took over, the United States flew its helicopters to get as many people out as we possibly could. We did continue covert operations against the communist government of Vietnam until 1978, but the war itself really comes to an end in 1975. However, when the northern communists take over in the south, one of the things they start to do is they start to round up people who are anti-communists and execute them. That's why so many people were trying desperately to get away. And one of the really tragic stories of this is, following the collapse of the South Vietnamese government, what we start to see in the late 70s all the way through the 1980s, and I actually remember this from being a kid in the early 80s, is what we call Vietnamese boat people. People who were so desperate that they would just load hundreds and hundreds of people up into a boat, and sometimes it wasn't even a boat, sometimes it was a raft or just a barrel that would float, and they would push themselves out into the South China Sea just to be able to get away. And a lot of times these people would be discovered sometimes horribly dehydrated and starving and just absolutely desperate because they were trying to get away from the horrific situations that were happening in communist Vietnam. Now, next, we've got to deal with another piece of French Indochina, which is the pink country there called Cambodia. Now, in Cambodia, we also get a communist revolution. This communist revolution is going to come from a guy named Pol Pot, and that's who we're looking at here, who is the leader of a movement called the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer was the ethnic group of people, and the Rouge part means red, and of course what that means is that these people are communists. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge led a revolution in Cambodia to try to take it back to the greatness of the old Khmer Empire. And what they talked about was, they said, we were better off when we weren't doing things the way that Western European countries were, living in cities and operating factories and doing things in that particular way. So what we're going to do is we're going to push the clock back and we're going to force people to live as though it is the 13th century again. So when the Khmer Rouge takes over, they force people out of the cities onto giant collective farms. The problem with this is, let's say for example that you were a doctor or a lawyer before the Khmer Rouge took over. They can't just magically remove that from you and all of a sudden force you to be a farmer. They know that you still have lots and lots of knowledge that other people don't. And so the Khmer Rouge decided that they were going to socially engineer their country into being a perfect communist utopia where everyone was absolutely equal. If you were a person that couldn't be forced to be equal because you were, a doctor or a lawyer or a professor or a school teacher or anybody like that, or a religious leader, ultimately, you were a problem that couldn't be solved through social engineering, and so what they did instead is they started a process that we refer to as the killing fields, where they would find people who were not ethnically Cambodian, people who were educated, people who were anti-communists. They would round them up, and they would just have humongous mass executions. In fact, they had death camps specifically set up to force people into either starvation, or they would torture them to death, or they would work them to death. There were about 20,000, and just one of these camps, which was called S-21, which is actually it's a really, really famous one. There were about 20,000 inmates at S-21, and only 7 of those people survived. This is the wholesale killing of people in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, and again, we refer to this as the killing fields. The estimated numbers of dead are somewhere around 1.7, perhaps even higher, million people out of a total population of about 7 million people. So you're talking about somewhere between 20 and maybe even as high as a third of all Cambodian people were murdered and massacred by their own government. Now, eventually, what happened was the Khmer Rouge actually got so out of control that actually the communists in Vietnam decided that they were going to stop them. And so there was a war between Cambodia and Vietnam won that and actually forced the Khmer Rouge out of power. But this is a really good example of what happens in a communist country when they're trying to engineer society to be the perfect kind of communist utopian model that they want. These are the sorts of things that happen. And of course, that's why communism as an ideology has an incredibly high body count. So I hope that this video was informative to you. I hope that you're having a good time of making it through the curriculum. I hope that you're continuing to watch these videos. Please leave a like and a comment in the comments below. Subscribe for notifications for more videos. And of course, if you're having questions, leave me a question or a comment either in my email, or you're of course always welcome to leave a comment on Google Classroom. Next time, we're going to look at section 5 of this unit, which is going to be all about the end of the Cold War and how the Cold War concludes itself in the early part of the 1990s. So stay healthy, stay safe, everybody, and I'll see you in the next video.